Good afternoon. Ferdun Nahad was 42 years old when his life ended in an alley in the Midway district. For the past 4 months, his death has been under investigation and review by the district attorney's office. Mr. Nahad was a son and a brother, and we continue to offer our heartfelt condolences to his family. Unfortunately, despite their efforts to help, Mr. Nahad had a troubled and violent history with his family and with other people with whom he came into contact. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, Mr. Nahad was physically violent towards his mother and sisters, punching them in the face and in the stomach, for example. He made threats to kill them on several occasions. On numerous occasions, they reported they were afraid he would use a knife to stab them or kill them. His repeated threats and aggression towards his immediate family led to restraining orders and brief hospital commitments over the past 11 years. The most recent request for a restraining order came just 17 days before the shooting. It was filed by Mr. Nahad's mother, who stated in the document, "I am afraid for my safety and security." The letter we're providing to the San Diego Police Department summarizes those incidents, and in a moment I'll explain why this violent history is relevant to our decision. At the time of his death, Mr. Nahad was living on the streets, as is the case with so many of our homeless who have mental health issues. Our investigation showed there were many opportunities and attempts to get Mr. Nahad into treatment and get him the help he clearly needed. But in the end, the system failed Mr. Nahad, just as it's failing so many suffering from mental health issues in our nation. Last year, more than 16,000 calls for service to the San Diego Police Department were mental health related. This number doesn't even include the other law enforcement agencies in our county. In fact, the percentage of mental health related calls to San Diego PD has doubled over the past 7 years. Law enforcement does its best to steer the mentally ill toward help, but the criminal justice system is only one piece of the puzzle. In Mr. Nahad's case, law enforcement was left to deal with his mental illness each of the many times they encountered him. That was the case on the early morning hours of April 30th, when San Diego police officer Neil Browder received a radio call of a man threatening people with a knife. It's notable, by the way, that the circumstances of this specific incident follow a common theme that's outlined in our 20-year review of officer-involved shooting cases. Most shootings happen in an alley or a street, as did this one. Most occur in the first 60 seconds the officer arrives on the scene, as did this one. And perhaps most importantly, in 81% of the cases, the person who was shot had drugs in their system or had mental health issues. In this case, drugs and mental health issues both played a role. First, I want to briefly summarize some of the key evidence from our officer's review that provides some important context. In the early morning hours of April 30th, the San Diego Police Department received a 911 call about a man threatening people with a knife. Radio communications to officers in the field repeatedly described the suspect as being armed with a knife and that the situation was ongoing. In other words, there was an immediate threat. Officer Browder heard 5 times that the suspect was armed with a knife before he arrived at the scene, an area that's a home to a large transient population and very near to the county's mental health facility. When he arrived, Officer Browder encountered Mr. Nahad walking directly toward him with a shiny object in his hand. Mr. Nahad constantly manipulated this item, twirling it in his hand and holding his arm at a 90-degree angle. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know it was a pen. But Mr. Nahad was not holding the object like one would hold a pen. He rotated it in a manner that's consistent with opening or closing what's known to law enforcement as a butterfly knife. Mr. Nahad continued advancing on Officer Browder, crossing the alley and coming directly toward him. At no time did he stop. When asked later what he believed would have happened if he had not fired at Mr. Nahad, Officer Browder replied, and I quote, "He was going to stab me. There's no doubt in my mind that he was going to stab me." There were 3 witnesses to the events leading up to the shooting. 2 witnesses heard Officer Browder demand that the suspect drop the knife. Another witness said he believed he heard Officer Browder tell Mr. Nahad to stop. 2 independent witnesses say they believed Mr. Nahad was holding a knife. So to be clear, Officer Browder's perception that the suspect was armed with a knife was shared by 2 civilians in the immediate vicinity, civilians whom Officer Browder believed were also in danger. Toxicology results later revealed that Mr. Nahad had cannabinoids and THC in his system. A number of studies have found that cannabis intoxication can exacerbate pre-existing psychotic diseases. As you're well aware, there is a video surveillance of the shooting, and a judge in a related civil action is being asked by media outlets to release it. While the district attorney's office has no plans to release the video, it's possible that at some point the video will become public. The video captured this incident from one angle, high up on a pole, without audio. It did not capture what Officer Browder could see, what he sensed, what he said, or what he reasonably believed. Should the video ever be released in the future, I hope the public will view it in the context of all the evidence, as we did. Every resource has been brought to bear in investigating, reviewing, and making the correct charging decision in this case. Next, what we have to do is apply the facts to the law. It's important that the public understand the legal standards we must follow when reviewing officer-involved shooting cases. The law prohibits us from looking at the officer's decision to use deadly force from the perspective of a Monday morning quarterback. Evidence shows Mr. Nahad was approximately 17 feet from the officer and continuing to advance. Officer Browder had just seconds to make his decision. In fact, Officer Browder fired his weapon just 32 seconds after arriving in the alley. By law, we must consider what Officer Browder reasonably believed at the time, without the benefit of hindsight. This is the legal question that we face. At the moment he fired, was it reasonable, based on the totality of the evidence, for Officer Browder to be in fear for his life? We apply it then to these facts. A 911 hot call in response to a man threatening people with a knife. Confirmation that the person involved was made by the officer. The officer's observations corroborated by 2 independent witnesses that he believed the individual had a knife. His advance on the officer, crossing from one side of the alley toward the officer, his disregard of his commands to drop the knife and stop, and his continued advance within 17 feet of the officer and in close proximity to others. Our investigation and thorough review of the shooting show the answer is yes. Officer Browder's decision to shoot Mr. Nahad was reasonable, and he therefore bears no criminal liability for his actions. When officer-involved shooting cases occur, one question that often comes up is why didn't the officer use less than lethal force like pepper spray or a taser? The evidence supports Officer Browder's belief that because the incident happened so quickly, he did not have a chance to use any other force options. Now, as part of our review, and in addition to the experience and expertise of the investigators involved, an independent expert outside of San Diego County was consulted. He found that Officer Browder's actions, and I'll quote, were consistent with those of a trained and reasonable officer, including using deadly force to defend against the immediate threat to his life that Mr. Nahad presented. He further agreed that it was reasonable and prudent for Officer Browder to perceive the object held by Mr. Nahad was a knife. Finally, the expert's opinion was that other, less lethal force would not have protected the officer or the civilians who were nearby. I take my duty to review officer-involved shooting cases very seriously. The purpose of the District Attorney's review is to provide an independent review of all shootings to assure the public that peace officers in San Diego County are performing their duties in a legally justified manner. This review, though, does not examine such issues as compliance with the policies and procedures of any law enforcement agency, ways to improve training, or any issues related to civil liability. Multiple other reviews are done for these purposes. A team from our Special Operations Division has been investigating and reviewing this shooting. They've left no stone unturned and have been tireless in their efforts. Working alongside them, I have personally reviewed all of the evidence and visited the scene at the same time of night as when the shooting occurred. Lastly, I would also like to note that as part of our legal analysis, we must consider Mr. Nahad's serious history of violence, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. If criminal charges were filed, a jury would be instructed that they could consider Mr. Nahad's past history in evaluating the officer's beliefs. That legal reality must be included when we consider whether or not to file criminal charges against the officer and whether they could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. As I said, I don't take these decisions lightly or without careful consideration. I have prosecuted law enforcement officers in the past and will continue to do so when charges are legally supported. Officer Browder has had an exemplary 27-year career with the San Diego Police Department. He has never used his firearm in an officer-involved shooting prior to this incident. In a moment, we'll provide you with copies of the 15-page letter sent to San Diego Police Chief Shelley Zimmerman regarding our decision. I encourage you to read it carefully for even more details about this incident, the evidence, and our review. Finally, I have no doubt that some headlines regarding today's announcement will read simply, DA justifies shooting of unarmed man. Many people won't read past those headlines for context, but instead might use this decision to feed the anti-law enforcement narrative that currently exists in the United States. But I hope there will also be a subheadline, one that focuses on the mental illness challenges we face in this country. One that spurs a parallel discussion about how we can stop people from falling through the cracks and get them treatment. Nationwide, more than 11 million individuals cycle in and out of county-related jails every year. It's estimated that up to 64% of them will suffer from mental illness. Recently, the U.S. Congress was briefed on improving mental health care from jails to communities, emphasizing the role counties play at the intersection of behavioral health and the criminal justice system. An annual count of the homeless conducted in January here in San Diego show 8,742 homeless people, with just over half in shelters. People shouldn't have to wait until they land in jail or find themselves in life-threatening situations to receive the mental health treatment and care they deserve. And as President Obama said just shortly in a speech to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, too often law enforcement gets scapegoated for the broader failures of our society. We can't expect our officers to contain and control the problems that the rest of us are not willing to face. In San Diego County, we have taken the important step of adopting Laura's Law, which will soon be implemented. But we can all do more.